You wake up at 3 in the morning with your heart racing, scrolling through social media, checking how many people liked your latest post, comparing your achievements to former classmates, mentally calculating whether you have posted enough success indicators this month to maintain your perceived status. Your chest feels tight because someone with less experience just got promoted before you, and now you are lying awake creating elaborate scenarios in your mind about what you will say at the next family gathering to justify your current position, rehearsing the story you will tell to make your life sound more impressive than it feels. You have spent years building a resume that looks perfect on paper, accumulating titles and credentials like armor, yet somehow the validation never lasts longer than a few days before you need another achievement to feel worthy again. This exhausting cycle of proving yourself has become so automatic that you cannot remember the last time you made a decision based purely on what you actually wanted, rather than what would look good to others, or silence the critical voices in your head telling you that you are not enough. The weight of constantly needing external validation affects every corner of your existence. Your relationships suffer because you cannot be vulnerable without fear of judgment. Your creativity dies because you only pursue projects that guarantee recognizable success. Your body deteriorates from stress because rest feels like falling behind. And your sense of self becomes so entangled with achievement that you genuinely do not know who you are without your titles and accomplishments. You have become a performance artist in your own life, carefully curating every word, every outfit, every social media post to project an image of someone who has it all together, someone who is winning, someone who is worthy of respect and admiration. The irony crushes you on those rare, honest moments, this reality that the more you achieve, the more hollow you feel, because deep down you know that no external validation will ever fill the internal void that drives this relentless need to prove yourself in the first place. The most revolutionary discovery Abraham Maslow made was not about ambition or success. It was about the precise psychological shift that occurs when a human being finally transcends the need for external validation, and why this transformation represents the most significant milestone in psychological development that most people never reach because they remain trapped in what Maslow identified as deficiency needs rather than growth needs. Today, I am going to show you the exact characteristics of this psychological stage that Maslow documented through decades of research, the specific internal shifts that occur when someone reaches it, and most importantly, the practical pathway he identified for moving from a life controlled by the need to prove yourself toward what he called self-actualization, where your worth becomes an internal certainty rather than an external performance. In 1943, when Maslow was conducting research at Brooklyn College, he encountered a patient who would fundamentally change his understanding of human motivation. This woman, a successful attorney in her late 40s, came to him not because she was failing, but because despite achieving everything she had set out to accomplish, winning cases, earning partnership, gaining respect in her field, she felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness that she could not explain to anyone around her. She described lying awake at night feeling like a fraud, despite objective evidence of her competence, constantly scanning her environment for signs of disapproval, unable to enjoy her achievements because she was already focused on the next thing she needed to accomplish to maintain her status. What fascinated Maslow was not her success or her anxiety, but something she said during their 5th session that stopped him completely. She told him that she had realized she was living her entire life as if she were still that little girl trying to earn her father's approval, except now her father was everyone, every colleague, every client, every person who might judge whether she was good enough, and she had no idea who she would be if she stopped performing for this invisible audience. Maslow began documenting this pattern across dozens of his patients and research subjects, noticing that high-achieving individuals often suffered from what he came to understand as esteem level stagnation, a psychological state where people became trapped at the 4th level of his hierarchy of needs, endlessly seeking respect, recognition, and status from others, but never progressing to the 5th level he would later call self-actualization. He noticed that these individuals shared specific characteristics regardless of their field or background. They made decisions based primarily on how those decisions would be perceived by others, rather than on internal values or genuine interest. They experienced anxiety that was disproportionate to actual threats, because any potential failure or criticism felt like an existential threat to their identity. They struggled with imposter syndrome despite objective competence because their sense of worth was externally derived rather than internally grounded. They could not rest or be present because stillness felt like falling behind in the constant competition for status and approval. They had difficulty forming authentic relationships because vulnerability felt too risky when your entire identity depends on appearing capable and successful. The attorney who had prompted this line of inquiry worked with Maslow for nearly 2 years, and during that time he documented her gradual psychological transformation in meticulous detail. She began to notice the automatic thoughts that drove her behavior, the constant internal commentary judging whether her performance was good enough, whether people were impressed, whether she was maintaining her position in the social hierarchy. She started recognizing how much energy she devoted to impression management rather than actual engagement with her work or relationships. She became aware of the fear underlying her ambition, this terror that if she stopped proving herself, people would discover she was not actually special or valuable. As she developed this awareness, something Maslow had not fully anticipated began to occur. She started making small decisions based on internal preference rather than external impression. She turned down a high-profile case that would have boosted her reputation because she genuinely was not interested in that area of law. She admitted uncertainty in a meeting instead of pretending to have all the answers. She spent a weekend doing absolutely nothing productive without guilt. These small acts of authenticity, Maslow observed, began to shift her entire psychological foundation. What Maslow discovered through this case and many others was that the transition from esteem needs to self-actualization was not about achieving more or becoming more impressive. It was about a fundamental shift in the source of your worth from external validation to internal values, from performance to authenticity, from proving to being. He identified this as perhaps the most significant psychological milestone in human development because it represented a shift from what he called deficiency motivation, behavior driven by trying to fill a lack or avoid a threat, to growth motivation, behavior driven by the desire to develop your capacities and express your authentic self. The people who made this transition, Maslow found, exhibited remarkably consistent characteristics. They became less concerned with others' opinions while becoming more considerate of others' actual well-being. They developed what he called autonomy, an inner directedness that allowed them to make decisions based on their own judgment rather than social pressure. They experienced more frequent moments of what he called peak experiences, profound moments of joy, understanding or connection that were not dependent on achievement or recognition. They became more authentic in their relationships because they no longer needed to maintain a carefully curated image. They developed a clearer sense of their actual values and potential rather than values adopted to gain approval. Have you ever caught yourself crafting the perfect response to sound intelligent rather than just saying what you actually think? Have you spent hours worrying about what someone might think of a decision you made, replaying conversations in your mind, analyzing whether you came across well, whether you maintained your image, whether you said something that might have diminished how impressive you seem? I know how exhausting it is to live inside that constant performance, to feel like you are always on stage being evaluated, to wake up already calculating what you need to accomplish today to feel worthwhile. If this resonates with you, leave a simple comment with this exact phrase: I am ready to stop performing and start being. Your experience can be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in this struggle. You have more power to help others than you imagine, because your honesty about your own journey can give someone else permission to stop pretending and start healing. Maslow spent the next 15 years studying individuals who had made this transition to what he eventually termed self-actualization, and what he found contradicted many assumptions about human motivation and success. The first pattern he documented was what he called psychological freedom from the good opinion of others. These self-actualizing individuals still appreciated respect and recognition when it came, but their sense of worth did not depend on it. They could receive criticism without experiencing it as an identity threat because their value was not contingent on universal approval. They could pursue interests or projects that others did not understand or appreciate because external validation was no longer the primary motivation. They experienced failure and setback as information and redirection rather than as evidence of unworthiness. This psychological freedom Maslow emphasized was not arrogance or indifference to others. It was a fundamental shift in the locus of evaluation from outside to inside, from others' judgments to your own assessment based on your values and standards. The second pattern Maslow identified was movement from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. People trapped in esteem needs were motivated primarily by external rewards, status, titles, recognition, money, approval, power over others. Those who had transitioned to self-actualization were motivated primarily by the inherent satisfaction of developing their capacities, contributing to something meaningful, expressing their authentic values, engaging with challenges that stretched their abilities. Maslow documented how this shift in motivation changed not just what people pursued, but how they experienced their daily lives. The attorney from his original study, for instance, shifted from taking cases based on prestige and visibility to taking cases based on whether the legal questions genuinely interested her and whether she believed in the client's cause. Her income actually decreased slightly in the short term, but her satisfaction and sense of meaning increased dramatically because she was no longer performing for an audience, but engaging authentically with work that mattered to her. The third pattern that emerged from Maslow's research was the development of what he called acceptance, both of self and others. Individuals operating from esteem needs tended to be highly critical, both of themselves and others, because the need to prove superiority requires constant comparison and judgment. Those who had reached self-actualization developed a more realistic and compassionate view of human nature, including their own limitations and imperfections. They could acknowledge their weaknesses without experiencing them as existential threats. They could recognize others' strengths without feeling diminished. They could accept that they were imperfect human beings doing their best, rather than needing to maintain an illusion of flawlessness. This acceptance, Maslow found, was not resignation or lowered standards. It was a psychological maturity that allowed people to work on genuine growth, rather than performing a false image of perfection. Maslow documented several types of individuals who struggled most with this transition from esteem to self-actualization. Type 1 was the chronic achiever, someone who had built their entire identity around accomplishment and success, accumulating degrees, titles, awards, and recognition, but experiencing increasing emptiness because the validation never lasted, and the goalposts constantly moved. These individuals often experienced what Maslow called success depression, a profound sense of meaninglessness that occurred despite or even because of achievement. When they finally reached their goals only to discover that external success did not deliver the internal fulfillment they had expected. Type 2 was the external validator, someone whose sense of self was so dependent on others' opinions that they experienced constant anxiety, constantly reading social cues, interpreting every interaction as evidence of whether they were valued or rejected, unable to trust their own judgment because the only real measure of worth they recognized was others' approval. These individuals often struggled with decision paralysis because any choice carried the risk of disapproval, and they frequently changed their opinions or preferences to align with whoever they were with, because adaptability felt safer than authenticity. Type 3 was the defensive superior, someone who maintained their sense of worth by positioning themselves above others, constantly comparing, competing, and proving they were smarter, more successful, more capable, more enlightened than those around them. These individuals often alienated the very people whose approval they sought because their defensiveness and need to be right made authentic connection impossible. Type 4 was the imposter performer, someone who achieved external success but experienced persistent imposter syndrome, feeling like a fraud despite competence, unable to internalize their accomplishments because they attributed success to luck or deception rather than genuine ability. These individuals lived in constant fear of being exposed as not actually worthy of their position or recognition, and this fear drove them to work harder and achieve more in an exhausting cycle that never resolved the underlying belief in their inadequacy. What made these patterns particularly insidious, Maslow observed, was that the behaviors driven by esteem needs often led to real external success, which then reinforced the pattern even though it did not resolve the underlying psychological need. The chronic achiever did accomplish impressive things. The external validator did develop sophisticated social skills. The defensive superior did often outperform others. The imposter performer did achieve positions of influence and respect. But none of these external successes addressed the core issue, which was the absence of an internal sense of worth that was not contingent on performance or approval. Maslow documented case after case of highly successful individuals who remained psychologically trapped at the esteem level, unable to enjoy their success, unable to rest, unable to be authentic, unable to form deep connections, because their sense of self remained dependent on external validation that could never be secured permanently. The dangers of remaining stuck at this stage, Maslow found, extended far beyond individual suffering. People operating primarily from esteem needs often harmed others in their pursuit of status and validation. They exploited colleagues to advance their careers. They manipulated relationships to maintain their image. They sacrificed their own values and the well-being of others to avoid criticism or gain approval. They raised children who inherited the same pattern of contingent worth based on achievement and performance. They created organizational cultures of competition and defensiveness rather than collaboration and authenticity. They contributed to social systems that valued image over substance, status over contribution, performance over genuine development. Maslow became increasingly concerned about the social consequences of so many individuals remaining developmentally stuck at esteem needs, creating what he saw as a culture of chronic insecurity, masked by impressive credentials and carefully managed images. The solution Maslow proposed was not to diminish achievement or become indifferent to others' perspectives. It was to develop what he described as a more integrated sense of self, where worth was grounded in internal values and authentic self-knowledge rather than external performance and validation. He outlined a process that moved through several specific phases, though he emphasized that this was not a linear progression, but a cyclical deepening of awareness and integration. Phase 1 was developing awareness of the pattern itself, beginning to notice the automatic thoughts and behaviors driven by the need to prove yourself, recognizing how much of your decision-making is based on impression management rather than authentic preference, acknowledging the fear and insecurity that drives the constant performance. This awareness, Maslow emphasized, required honest self-examination without self-judgment, looking clearly at your patterns not to condemn yourself but to understand the psychological mechanisms maintaining your suffering. Phase 2 was questioning the beliefs underlying the need to prove yourself, examining whether your worth really is contingent on achievement and approval, whether you are actually in as much danger as your anxiety suggests if you fail or are criticized, whether the identity you are defending is actually who you are or just a constructed image. Maslow found that most people operating from esteem needs held unconscious beliefs formed in childhood. Beliefs like my worth depends on my accomplishments. If people really knew me, they would reject me. I have to be impressive to be loved. Rest is weakness, vulnerability is dangerous, I am only as valuable as my last achievement. These beliefs, formed in response to early experiences, continued to operate automatically unless deliberately examined and challenged. Phase 3 was beginning to act from your authentic values rather than from the need for approval, making small decisions based on what you actually want or believe, rather than what will look good, allowing yourself to be imperfect and visible in that imperfection, engaging with activities for their inherent interest, rather than their status value. Maslow emphasized that this phase required courage because it meant risking the disapproval you had organized your entire life around avoiding. Phase 4 was developing what Maslow called your inner compass, a clearer sense of your actual values, interests, strengths, and purposes that was not borrowed from others or adopted to gain acceptance. This required time in reflection and solitude, something most people trapped in esteem needs avoided, because stillness brought them face to face with the emptiness beneath their performance. It required experimenting with different expressions of yourself to discover what felt authentic versus what felt like performance. It required developing trust in your own perception and judgment rather than constantly seeking external confirmation. Phase 5 was integration, where your sense of worth became genuinely internal, where you could appreciate recognition without depending on it, where you could acknowledge failure without experiencing it as identity annihilation, where you could pursue your development for its inherent satisfaction rather than for proving something to yourself or others. Maslow documented several historical figures and research subjects who exemplified this transition. Eleanor Roosevelt, who transformed from a shy woman desperate for approval to someone who could say, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent," demonstrated this shift from external to internal locus of worth. Viktor Frankl, who discovered meaning and purpose even in a concentration camp, exemplified motivation beyond survival and esteem, needs toward what Maslow recognized as self-actualization and self-transcendence. The research subjects Maslow studied who had made this transition shared certain experiences. They often described a crisis or breaking point where the pursuit of external validation became untenable, either because they achieved their goals and found them empty, or because they faced failure or loss that destroyed their carefully constructed image. They described a period of disorientation and grief as they let go of the identity they had built around others' approval. They described gradual experimentation with authenticity, testing whether they could still be valuable without constant performance. They described moments of unexpected freedom and joy when they made choices based on internal preference rather than external impression. They described deeper relationships that formed when they stopped performing and started being genuine. They described a sense of coming home to themselves, of finally inhabiting their own lives rather than performing for an invisible audience. In contrast, Maslow documented individuals who never made this transition, remaining psychologically trapped at esteem needs throughout their lives. Some achieved extraordinary external success, accumulating impressive credentials and recognition, but remained internally insecure, never experiencing the peace or fulfillment their achievements were supposed to deliver. Some became increasingly bitter and defensive as they aged, unable to accept their limitations or diminishing relevance, clinging desperately to past achievements and status. Some experienced late-life crises when retirement or aging diminished their ability to achieve and perform, suddenly facing the emptiness they had avoided their entire lives through constant activity and accomplishment. Some died having never discovered who they actually were beneath the performance, having never experienced the freedom of living from authentic values rather than from the need to prove themselves worthy of existence. The individuals who successfully transitioned to self-actualization, Maslow found, did not become less effective or ambitious. In many cases, they became more productive because their energy was no longer drained by constant anxiety about others' opinions and by maintaining elaborate performances. They became more creative because they were free to explore genuine interests rather than only pursuing recognizable success. They became better leaders because they could focus on mission and purpose rather than on defending their status. They became more resilient because failure was information rather than identity threat. They formed deeper relationships because authenticity allowed real connection. They experienced greater well-being because their sense of worth was stable rather than contingent on constantly proving themselves. They contributed more meaningfully to others and to society because their actions arose from authentic values and compassion rather than from the need to appear impressive or superior. What makes Maslow's work particularly relevant today is that modern culture in many ways intensifies the esteem trap. Social media creates constant opportunities for comparison and performance, where you can measure your worth against others' curated success, and where every moment can be staged for audience approval. Professional culture often rewards external achievement while providing little space for reflection on internal values and authentic development. Consumer culture markets the message that worth comes from what you have and how you appear, rather than from who you are and how you live. Educational systems focus on measurable achievement and competition, rather than on developing self-knowledge and internal motivation. The result, Maslow would likely observe, is a culture where vast numbers of people are psychologically trapped at esteem needs, achieving external success while experiencing internal emptiness, constantly performing while never feeling good enough, accumulating recognition while never developing genuine self-acceptance or authentic purpose. The attorney who began Maslow's investigation into this psychological stage eventually made a complete transition to what he recognized as self-actualization. Years after their formal work together ended, she wrote him a letter describing her experience. She explained that she had left her prestigious law firm to work for a public interest organization, taking a significant pay cut, but finding deeper satisfaction in work that aligned with her actual values. She described finally being able to rest without guilt, to admit uncertainty without shame, to pursue interests that others did not understand, to form relationships where she could be vulnerable and imperfect. She wrote that the most unexpected aspect of the transformation was not increased happiness, though she did feel more content, but increased aliveness, a sense that she was finally inhabiting her own life rather than performing someone else's script, finally making choices from the inside out rather than from the outside in, finally becoming the person she actually was rather than the person she thought she needed to be to deserve love and belonging. Maslow spent his final years emphasizing that self-actualization was not a destination, but an ongoing process, not a state of perfection but a commitment to growth and authenticity. He stressed that people could operate from different levels of the hierarchy in different areas of life, being self-actualized in their work but still seeking validation in their relationships, for instance. He acknowledged that complete freedom from the need for external validation might be impossible, but that the direction of development was what mattered, the gradual shift from worth that depends on performance and approval toward worth that is grounded in your authentic being and expression. He emphasized that this transition was not selfish, but was actually the foundation for genuine contribution and compassion, because only when you stop trying to prove your worth can you focus on expressing your values and serving purposes larger than your ego. The path from proving to being, from performance to authenticity, from external validation to internal integrity, is perhaps the most significant journey you will ever make, because it determines not just how you feel, but who you actually become and what you contribute during your brief time alive. The attorney from Maslow's original research eventually told him something that he quoted in his later writings. She said that before her transformation, she had been living her entire life in the third person, always watching herself from outside, evaluating how she appeared, managing the impression she made but never actually present in her own experience. After the transition, she said, she finally began living in the first person, inhabiting her life from the inside, making choices from her actual values and desires, being present in her own moments rather than performing for an invisible audience. This shift, she told Maslow, was what it meant to finally become real, to stop being a character you were playing and start being the actual person you are, with all your imperfections and limitations and unique capacities and authentic purposes. You remember that attorney, the one who came to Maslow despite her external success, the one who was living her entire life as if she were still that little girl, trying to earn impossible approval. Years after their work together, she no longer woke at 3 a.m. calculating whether she had achieved enough to be worthy. She no longer spent her energy managing others' impressions or performing constant competence. She made decisions based on her values rather than on what would look impressive. She could be uncertain, imperfect, vulnerable, and still know her inherent worth. She contributed meaningfully not to prove herself, but to express herself and serve purposes she genuinely cared about. She formed relationships where she could finally be seen and known as she actually was, rather than as her carefully managed image. This transformation, from proving to being, from performance to presence, from external worth to internal integrity, is what Maslow identified as the most significant psychological milestone available to human beings. It is available to you not through more achievement or recognition, but through the courage to question the beliefs that make your worth contingent, to experiment with authenticity despite the fear, to develop your inner compass and learn to trust it, to gradually shift from living for an audience to living from your values. I know how exhausting the performance has become, how much energy you spend managing impressions and calculating whether you are good enough, how hollow achievement feels when it does not resolve the underlying need to prove yourself worthy of existence. The journey from esteem to self-actualization is not about achieving more or becoming more impressive. It is about fundamentally shifting the foundation of your worth from external to internal, from conditional to inherent, from performance to being. It is about discovering that you do not have to prove anything to be valuable, that your worth is not contingent on achievement or approval, that you can be imperfect and still be enough, that authenticity is more satisfying than performance, that your most meaningful contribution comes not from proving your superiority, but from expressing your authentic capacities and values. This journey we have explored today, from the exhausting trap of constantly needing to prove yourself toward the psychological freedom of self-actualization, represents a path that Maslow dedicated his life to mapping because he believed it was the key to both individual fulfillment and collective well-being. If this exploration has resonated with you, if you recognize yourself in the patterns we have discussed, if you feel ready to begin shifting from performance toward authenticity, I invite you to continue discovering these insights with us. We explore Maslow's work and the broader landscape of human development and psychological growth each week, diving deep into the mechanisms that keep us trapped and the pathways toward greater freedom and fulfillment. By joining us, you become part of a community that values authenticity over performance, growth over perfection, internal integrity over external validation. Click the button below to continue this journey of discovering who you actually are beneath the performance, of developing your capacity for self-actualization, of learning to live from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Your transformation begins with the decision to stop proving and start being, and we are here to support that unfolding every step of the way. Next, we will explore the specific psychological defense mechanisms Maslow identified that keep people trapped at esteem needs, the unconscious strategies you use to avoid the vulnerability of authenticity while maintaining the exhausting performance of proving your worth, and most importantly, the practical techniques for recognizing and transforming these patterns so you can finally experience the freedom of living from your authentic self rather than from the need for external validation.